The morning 400 guests showed up at my field, every one of them holding a parking pass with the Homeowners Association logo printed across the top. Priscilla Dane stood by my gate smiling like the 14 acres behind me belonged to her, and she told me to take the lock off before I embarrassed the entire community. I did not move. Hanging from the chain was a court order, a county seal, and a survey map proving the association had never once held the right to cross that gate. When the sheriff's deputy opened his folder and started reading it out loud in front of everyone, Priscilla's face went white because the signature at the bottom of her contract was never mine. My name is Wyatt Gannon, and before that morning, most people in Briar Glen Estates did not know my name at all. They knew me as the fence man, the guy who mowed the low ground behind the clubhouse, the quiet neighbor who kept his truck parked at odd angles and never showed up to a single community potluck. What they did not know, because they never bothered to ask, was that I owned 14 acres of open fields sitting just outside their manicured boundary, land my uncle left me the year he passed. Land with a working drainage system underneath it and a single steel gate that opened onto a private road nobody else had any legal claim to. I restored soil and built fences for ranches across the county for a living, which meant I spent most of my days reading property lines the way other men read box scores, and it meant I kept records the way a farmer keeps seed, because a signature on a page had once saved my uncle's entire homestead from a boundary dispute that could have gone very differently. The field itself was nothing anyone from the association would call beautiful. There was no fountain, no stamped concrete path, no rows of crepe myrtles trimmed into identical shapes. What it had instead was a low spot that used to flood every spring until I regraded it, a stretch of native grass I cut for hay twice a year, and a perimeter fence my uncle and I had strung ourselves 2 decades earlier. It was the last piece of my family still standing on this earth, and I treated it that way, even when Priscilla Dane treated it like an eyesore she had simply not gotten around to fixing yet. She had asked me more than once to repaint the gate so it would match the association's approved color palette. She had asked me to keep the grass shorter, despite the fact that my land sat outside her jurisdiction entirely. She had asked to put up a welcome sign on my fence line facing the main road, and once, almost casually, she had asked whether I would consider signing over use of my private road to the community for what she called convenience access. Every time I said no, she looked at me the way a teacher looks at a student who has failed to grasp an obvious lesson, as though my refusal came from ignorance rather than ownership. I remember her leaning against her car one afternoon, sunglasses pushed up into her hair, telling me that men like me were usually too busy fixing fences to understand the value of cooperating with people who actually had influence in this town. I did not argue with her that day. I never did. I simply drove home, opened a drawer I kept for exactly this purpose, and added her email to a folder that already held 2 years of similar requests, each one a small brick in a wall I did not yet know I was building. My uncle used to say that a quiet man who keeps his paperwork straight will always outlast a loud one who does not, and I had spent enough years working ranches across the county to know he was right. I had watched families lose grazing rights because nobody kept a copy of an old deed, and I had watched other families keep everything they owned simply because one person in the house understood the difference between a handshake and a signature. That lesson shaped the way I lived long before Priscilla Dane ever pulled into Briar Glen Estates, and it shaped the folder sitting in my truck the day everything finally came to a head. Neighbors sometimes joked that I treated my field like it was sacred ground, and in a way they were not wrong. My uncle had taught me to read soil the way other men read weather, checking the give underfoot after a storm, watching where water pooled after heavy rain, learning which corners could hold weight and which could not. That knowledge mattered more than any decorative gate or manicured lawn ever could, because it meant I understood exactly what 400 cars parked across uneven, undrained ground could do to land that had taken years to heal. Then, on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, I walked my property line the way I did most weeks and found a wooden stake driven into the middle of my field, a strip of yellow ribbon tied around it fluttering in the wind. Written on a plastic tag zip tied to the stake were 4 words that stopped me cold. Parking row, section 3. Nobody had asked my permission. Nobody had called. Somebody had simply walked onto private land and started planning an event, as though the ground beneath their feet was already theirs. I pulled the stake out of the dirt, tossed it into the bed of my truck, and drove straight to the association office, where I found Priscilla in the middle of a meeting with a woman I did not recognize. A stack of glossy folders spread across the table between them. The woman turned out to be Tessa Wren, an event planner hired to run the Briar Glen Founders Gala, a fundraiser complete with a formal dinner, a silent auction, and a live band, the kind of evening designed to make the neighborhood feel important for one night a year. According to the printout in front of them, they were expecting more than 400 guests, while the clubhouse lot could barely hold 90 cars. And Priscilla had apparently decided my field would solve that shortage for her. She explained it to me the way she explained everything, in a tone that suggested she was doing me a favor. The field was sitting empty anyway, she said. The private road happened to border the subdivision. The whole arrangement would only last one day. My property value would practically thank her for the exposure. I told her plainly that I had never agreed to any of it, and she laughed in front of Tessa and 2 board members standing nearby, asking whether I honestly believed a patch of grass mattered more than an event that benefited the entire community. I asked whether tickets had already been sold. Tessa, who clearly had no idea she was stepping into the middle of a dispute, answered before Priscilla could stop her, telling me that 400 parking passes had gone up for online sale at $35 apiece, which put the total somewhere near $14,000. Priscilla cut in immediately, insisting the association held what she called historic access rights through the private road and did not need my consent at all. When I asked to see documentation proving any of that, she refused, telling me property records could get complicated, and she doubted a man who built fences for a living would follow the details anyway. I left without raising my voice, because raising my voice was never going to get me what I needed, which was proof. On my way home, I photographed every stake still standing in my field. I saved screenshots of the parking advertisement posted on the association's page. I bought 1 parking pass under a name that was not my own, just to keep the receipt on file, and I read every word of the digital ticket confirmation twice. Buried near the bottom, in small gray text most people would scroll straight past, was a single sentence that made my stomach tighten. It read that landowner authorization had been verified and was on file. Somewhere, according to that sentence, there existed a signed document with my name on it, and I had never signed anything in my life granting Priscilla Dane access to that field. I sent a formal email to the association that same night, requesting they immediately stop selling passes, remove any reference to my field from their advertising, refund every ticket already purchased, and provide me a copy of whatever authorization they claimed to be holding. Priscilla's reply came the next morning, short and clipped, stating the matter had already been handled by legal counsel and warning me not to sabotage what she called a community fundraiser out of what she assumed was personal spite. The following day, a work crew showed up at the mouth of my private road with a flatbed loaded with gravel, apparently under instructions to grade the entrance and prepare it for heavy traffic. I stood in front of the gate before the equipment could roll through it. The foreman handed me a work order carrying Priscilla's signature, and when I explained calmly that the land past that gate was private property with no easement of any kind attached to it, he read the paperwork again, looked at the gate, looked at me, and told his crew to load back up rather than risk being party to something he clearly sensed was not right. Priscilla arrived minutes later in a white SUV, furious that I had, in her words, made things difficult for men who were only trying to do their jobs. She told me I was letting wounded male pride turn a simple arrangement into a problem nobody needed. I told her the problem was not pride. It was ownership, insurance, and liability. 3 things that mattered a great deal more than her event schedule. I laid it out for her as plainly as I could. There was a shallow drainage line running under the western half of that field, easily damaged by heavy vehicles. There was a soft patch of ground near the center that could swallow a tire in wet weather. There were no lights installed anywhere on the property, no marked walking paths, and no staff trained to direct 400 cars safely across uneven ground after dark. There was, as far as I knew, no insurance policy covering a single one of those risks. Priscilla waved all of it away, insisting the association had a professional team on hand and accusing me, not for the first time, of simply looking for a bigger payday. She offered me $500 after the event concluded, with nothing in writing to back the promise, and I turned it down without hesitation. That same week I hired Cole Maddox, a land surveyor I had worked with before, to walk the property boundary and confirm exactly what rights, if any, still existed on the old road that ran along the edge of my land. Cole found what I already suspected. There had once been a wagon trail crossing a corner of the property decades ago, but the previous owner had legally terminated that right of passage more than 20 years earlier, and no public easement, association privilege, or emergency access clause had ever replaced it. There was nothing left to argue over, at least not honestly. Cole pulled out a printed map that had apparently been circulating among event vendors and pointed to the boundary line marked across it. The line had been shifted nearly 80 feet into my field, well past where the actual survey stakes sat in the ground. That kind of error does not happen by accident on a document meant to guide contractors and traffic planners. Somebody had deliberately altered that map, and I intended to find out exactly who. I brought everything I had gathered to Audrey Pike, a real estate attorney with a reputation for being quiet in a room right up until the moment she was not. Audrey read through the emails, the altered map, and the ticket confirmation, then told me the association could be exposed to several serious claims at once, including false advertising of property rights, trespass, unfair business practices, potential property damage, and negligence toward hundreds of guests who would be walking across ground with no permit and no safety plan behind it. Audrey sent a formal cease and desist letter by certified mail to Priscilla and every member of the board. Rather than pausing to reconsider, Priscilla sent her own message to the entire neighborhood, describing an unnamed, uncooperative landowner attempting to sabotage a charitable community event out of personal resentment. She never used my name directly, but everyone in Briar Glen understood exactly who she meant. And for a few uncomfortable days my phone rang with neighbors questioning my character, some accusing me of greed, others telling me to think about the community for once in my life. I did not respond publicly to any of it because every accusation Priscilla put into writing was, in its own way, more evidence against her, not less. Around that time, Lenora Finch, the association treasurer, reached out to me privately, clearly uneasy about what she had been watching unfold. She told me the board had never voted to secure use of my field for any event. No contract had ever been presented at a board meeting. When members had asked how parking would be handled, Priscilla had simply told them she had already worked things out directly with the landowner. Lenora also mentioned that ticket payments were being processed through an online account she did not recognize as belonging to the association at all, a detail that would matter far more than any of us understood at the time. The county planning department confirmed separately that no permit had ever been issued allowing use of my field as event parking, though they explained they needed proof the event was actually proceeding before they could issue any formal restraining action. I provided them everything I had collected: the photographs of the stakes, the ticket receipt, the advertisement, Priscilla's emails, and Cole's survey report, and they agreed to open a file. Not long after, Tessa called me directly, sounding confused rather than confrontational, asking why I was denying a contract that apparently carried my own signature. She emailed it to me before I could even respond. At the bottom of the page, beneath language I had never read before that day, sat my printed name, Wyatt Gannon, next to a signature that was close enough to fool a stranger but wrong in every detail a person who actually knew my handwriting would notice immediately. The document called itself a temporary event parking license. It claimed I had agreed to allow the association use of my field for 3 full days, covering setup, the event itself, and cleanup afterward. It stated I had already received $5,000 in exchange. It stated I would be personally responsible for the condition of the ground. It stated the association bore no liability whatsoever if a vehicle or a guest was injured on my property. It even included a clause permitting the association to remove my gate entirely if doing so became necessary for traffic flow. The signature carried a small but telling flaw in the shape of the letter G, a habit I have never once written that way in my life. The date on the contract placed my supposed signing on a day I could prove, through job invoices and fuel receipts, that I had been working an entirely different county 3 hours away. Tessa explained that Priscilla had personally delivered the signed contract to her office and had assured her, in person, that she had met with me and finalized every term. Tessa also recalled Priscilla specifically asking her to keep the payment amount quiet, framing it as a request from a landowner who did not want his neighbors knowing how much he had supposedly been paid. I checked every bank account and cash record I kept and confirmed, without any doubt, that no $5,000 had ever reached me from Priscilla Dane, the association, or anyone connected to either. Audrey pointed out something even more troubling once she studied the language closely. The contract was not simply designed to convince an event planner that permission existed. It was structured to shift every ounce of legal responsibility onto me if anything went wrong once 400 cars and their passengers crossed onto that field. Sitting across from Audrey's desk that afternoon, I read the forged document twice more, trying to understand exactly how someone builds a lie convincing enough to fool a professional event planner. The paragraphs were formatted the way a real contract should look, with numbered clauses and careful legal phrasing, the kind of language a person copies from somewhere rather than invents on the spot. Audrey pointed out that whoever drafted it clearly understood enough about liability waivers to know precisely which protections to strip away from me and which ones to hand entirely to the association. It was not the work of someone acting on impulse. It was the work of someone who had planned this for weeks. What troubled me most was not the forged signature itself, though seeing my own name twisted into something I never wrote left an uneasy feeling I could not shake for days. What troubled me was realizing how easily an ordinary person, someone like Tessa, could be handed a fraudulent document and have no real way of knowing it was false. She had no reason to doubt a chairwoman who spoke with that much confidence. That was the part of Priscilla's plan that unsettled me the most, the way she had weaponized her own credibility to make a lie look sturdier than the truth. While reviewing the correspondence Tessa forwarded, I found one line buried in an email Priscilla had written to her weeks earlier, a line that told me more about her intentions than any contract ever could. She had written that I was not worth worrying about, describing me as the kind of man who would complain for a few days and then quiet down once he realized everything had already been decided without him. Reading that line did not make me angry so much as it made everything click into place. This was never an oversight or a miscommunication. It was a calculated bet that a quiet man in work boots would fold the moment enough pressure landed on him. Audrey used that same email alongside the forged contract, the altered map, and the ticket sales records to file for an emergency injunction, arguing that irreversible harm was about to occur, that a fraudulent document was actively being used to justify trespass, and that hundreds of vehicles were on track to damage protected drainage infrastructure within days. The court scheduled an emergency hearing 2 days before the gala was set to take place. Priscilla filed her own response, claiming I had verbally agreed to the arrangement and then changed my mind purely because I wanted more money out of the deal. At the hearing, the judge asked her a single direct question that the entire courtroom seemed to lean toward hearing answered. She asked whether Priscilla could produce any bank transfer, any receipt, or any witness confirming that I had ever received a single dollar. Priscilla had nothing. Not a transaction, not a canceled check, not one person willing to testify they had seen money change hands. The judge granted a temporary restraining order that afternoon, and it carried real teeth. It barred the association, its contractors, and any ticket holders from entering my field under any circumstance. It barred anyone from removing or tampering with my gate or lock. It barred further advertising of my land as event parking. It explicitly permitted me to secure the gate and post a copy of the order directly on it, and it required the association to notify every ticket holder of the sudden change before the event took place. That same day, the county planning department posted its own notice at the entrance to my road, stating clearly that no event parking was authorized and that landowner consent had never been established. Audrey advised me to stop communicating with Priscilla altogether outside of formal, documented channels, a piece of advice I intended to follow to the letter. I spent that evening reinforcing the gate myself. I ran a heavier chain through the posts, added 2 hardened locks resistant to bolt cutters, mounted a camera aimed directly at the entrance, and posted clear private property signage where no one could claim they missed it. I also cleared a temporary turnaround area just outside the gate on the shoulder of the road, so any confused drivers would have somewhere safe to reverse rather than getting stuck along a narrow stretch with nowhere to go. I was not trying to punish 400 strangers who had done nothing wrong except buy a ticket in good faith. I was only trying to protect what was mine. Despite the injunction sitting in her hands, Priscilla never issued a refund and never sent a single notice warning ticket holders that parking access had changed. She apparently believed that once hundreds of people showed up expecting entry, I would panic under the weight of their frustration and unlock the gate myself rather than face an angry crowd. She reportedly told Tessa the court order was nothing more than an administrative misunderstanding that would sort itself out by the morning of the event. Lenora discovered that all 400 tickets were still marked active in the system days after the order had been issued. Priscilla went so far as to hire 2 private security guards to stand at my gate and check passes as though nothing had changed at all. One of the maintenance workers asked, apparently in passing, whether he should bring bolt cutters just in case. Priscilla's reply, preserved in writing, instructed him to be ready to handle any obstruction. I forwarded that email directly to Audrey and to the sheriff's office before the sun rose the next day. The night before the gala, I sat alone in my truck at the edge of the field, looking out over ground my uncle and I had once cleared together with nothing but shovels and stubbornness. I thought about the way Priscilla had told me a man like me could not possibly understand a contract, and I thought about how many people were about to arrive, expecting a smooth evening they had no idea was built on a lie. I felt no satisfaction in what was coming. If I opened that gate, I would be confirming, for her and for anyone watching, that enough money and enough social standing could override ownership itself, and I was not willing to hand her that lesson. The first car pulled up at 7:12 the next morning, headlights cutting through fog still clinging to the low ground. By 8 o'clock, the line stretched well past the entrance to the subdivision, engines idling, drivers craning their necks to see what was holding everything up. Priscilla stepped out of her white SUV wearing a white dress and a gold name badge that read Chairwoman across the front, walking toward me with the kind of smile a person wears when they still believe they have already won. She demanded I open the gate immediately, as though the events of the past 2 weeks had simply not happened. I pointed, without raising my voice, to the copy of the restraining order zip tied to the chain, to the county notice posted beside it, to the private property sign bolted into the fence post, and to the small camera quietly recording everything unfolding between us. She lowered her voice into something closer to a threat, telling me I would be held responsible for ruining the event, blocking traffic, and costing the association a significant amount of money. I told her I had warned her weeks earlier, and that the people arriving that morning had not been deceived by me. They had been deceived by whoever sold them a pass to a lot that never legally existed. Guests continued arriving, holding phones with digital tickets directing them to a location labeled Gannon Meadow, Gate A, a label someone had clearly created without ever asking my permission to use my own name. Some began recording video on their phones. Others demanded refunds on the spot from confused staff who had no answers to give them. Tessa arrived not long after, visibly stunned to realize Priscilla had never sent the notification the court had explicitly ordered. I stayed calm through all of it, directing cars toward the turnaround, offering water to a few staff members standing in the growing heat, helping an older couple find somewhere to sit near the fence line while they waited for information, and refusing under any circumstance to let a single vehicle pass beyond that gate. Priscilla tried once more to turn the crowd against me, claiming loudly that I had accepted payment and only backed out at the last possible moment out of greed. I asked her, in front of everyone close enough to hear, to produce any proof that money had ever changed hands. She had none, so she pivoted instead to insisting the road itself belonged to the community by long-standing custom. Cole Maddox happened to be present with his printed survey and confirmed, calmly and clearly, that every foot of that entrance sat entirely on my land, with no public or shared right-of-way anywhere near it. At one point she stepped close enough that only I could hear her clearly, and told me this entire standoff was really about my inability to accept that a woman could run something better than I ever could. I did not raise my voice. I told her I had no issue with a woman leading the association. My issue was with anyone, regardless of who they were, selling something they never actually owned. Several phones caught that exchange, and whatever narrative she had hoped to spin about wounded pride quietly fell apart in front of a crowd that had already grown tired of waiting. With the pressure building, Priscilla called emergency dispatch, claiming I was blocking a public roadway, endangering traffic, sabotaging a permitted community event, and unlawfully withholding association property behind a locked gate. She seemed genuinely convinced that once law enforcement arrived, they would simply order me to unlock the chain and let the backed-up traffic through. While we waited, Tessa began flipping back through her copy of the contract more carefully than she had before, and she noticed something odd on the final page, a witness name she had never actually met in person and a notarization stamp that appeared to have expired well before the supposed signing date. Around the same time, Lenora arrived on foot carrying a printed bank statement, pulling Audrey aside to explain that the $14,000 in ticket revenue had never once touched the association's official accounts. The heat kept climbing as the morning wore on, and the line of cars along the shoulder grew restless in a way that made even the security guards Priscilla had hired look uneasy. A few guests gave up entirely and turned around, muttering about wasted mornings and formal wear already wilting in the sun. Others stayed, drawn less by the promise of a parking spot and more by the spectacle unfolding at the gate, phones raised, waiting to see who would blink first. I kept my attention on the chain, on the lock, and on the steady stream of headlights still crawling toward a field they were never going to reach. A sheriff's patrol vehicle rolled to a stop at the edge of the crowd a short while later. Priscilla walked toward it immediately, announcing loudly that someone with real authority had finally arrived to make me open the gate. Deputy Ellis Boone stepped out, studied the heavy chain for a long moment, read the order posted on it from start to finish, then turned to Priscilla and asked a single question that seemed to hang in the air over the entire crowd. He asked her, plainly, who exactly had sold these people their parking passes. Priscilla insisted the association held a fully legal contract and had Tessa hand it over. Deputy Boone read it slowly while I stood beside him, and when he reached the signature line, he asked me directly whether it was mine. I told him, in front of the cameras still recording around us, that I had never seen that document until 2 days earlier. Audrey stepped forward with copies of the restraining order, the property deed, the survey report, the cease and desist letter, proof I had been working 3 hours away on the date the contract claimed I had signed it, and bank records showing no payment had ever arrived in my name. Deputy Boone read aloud the clause allowing the association to remove my gate if necessary, and asked Priscilla whether she had intended to have it cut open that morning. She tried to shift blame onto her maintenance worker, but the email already sitting in Audrey's folder made clear that the instruction to prepare for obstructions had come directly from her. Standing in front of the entire crowd, Deputy Boone laid out the reality of the situation without hesitation. The gate stood on private property. The court order remained fully valid. Cutting the lock could result in an arrest on the spot. A parking pass, no matter how official it looked, created no legal right to enter land the seller never owned. I had no obligation whatsoever to open that gate. Whoever had sold these tickets was the one who now owed every person standing there an explanation. He turned to Priscilla and told her plainly that she could not call law enforcement to enforce a contract when the landowner himself stated under his own name that he had never signed it. Tessa confirmed, without hesitation, that Priscilla had personally delivered that contract to her office. Lenora held up the bank statement as further proof that something beyond a simple misunderstanding had been happening for weeks. Whatever control Priscilla believed she still had over the story dissolved completely in front of everyone gathered along that road. Event staff scrambled to locate a commercial parking lot several miles away and arranged small shuttle vans to move guests back and forth, delaying the gala by nearly 3 hours. Every parking pass sold that morning had to be refunded in full. Footage of Priscilla demanding officers cut the lock, only to be corrected in front of a crowd of her own neighbors, spread quickly through the community in the days that followed. I did not celebrate any of it. Once the last car finally pulled away down the road, I folded up the small camp chair I had set beside the gate and walked back into my field, the same field my uncle and I had cleared together decades earlier. Before Lenora left that morning, she pulled me aside and told me something that would end up mattering more than the standoff itself. She said the $14,000 collected in ticket sales had not simply disappeared into the confusion of the day. It had gone somewhere specific into an account carrying the Dane family name. Over the following week, Lenora quietly compiled everything she had access to and handed it directly to the board and to Audrey. The money from every parking pass had been routed into an entity called Dane Civic Solutions, a consulting company owned entirely by Priscilla herself. She had signed a private agreement without any board vote, hiring her own company to serve as the official parking management vendor for an event she was already running as chairwoman. No meeting minutes reflected any approval of that arrangement. Priscilla apparently intended to keep a management fee off the top, use the remaining funds to cover budget shortfalls elsewhere in the gala, and rely on the forged contract to push every ounce of liability onto me if anything had gone wrong during the event itself. The entire plan depended on one condition holding steady: that I would fold under the pressure of 400 waiting guests and unlock that gate before anyone had time to look closely at where the money was really going. The board called an emergency meeting once Lenora's findings reached them. I attended with Audrey beside me, though I made clear from the beginning that I had no interest in punishing ordinary homeowners for decisions Priscilla had made entirely on her own. I asked for 3 things. I wanted the association to formally acknowledge in writing that it held no rights whatsoever to my field. I wanted them to cover the cost of the survey and the legal fees generated by their attempt to seize access to my land. I wanted Priscilla and her company held personally responsible for refunding every ticket sold under false pretenses. She stood in front of the board that evening and tried once more to frame the entire situation as personal retaliation from a landowner who resented never being properly respected by the community. This time, nobody in the room seemed willing to accept that framing. Tessa laid out the full email trail between herself and Priscilla. Lenora presented the bank statements showing exactly where the ticket revenue had landed. Audrey placed the forged signature beside a certified copy of my real one, and the difference was obvious even to board members with no legal training at all. The board voted that night to suspend Priscilla from her position as chairwoman effective immediately. Not long afterward, the association's insurance carrier sent notice that it might decline to cover any claims connected to Priscilla's actions on the grounds that fraudulent conduct and self-dealing typically fall outside the protection of a standard liability policy. The same woman who had once told me I would never understand the fine print of a contract now sat in silence while board members read her own forged document aloud, clause by clause, in front of the very neighbors she had spent years lecturing about community responsibility. I did not gloat, and I did not need to. I only told her, once the meeting reached its end, that she had been right about one thing all along, that contracts really did matter, which was exactly why nobody should ever forge someone else's signature onto one. Within days, the sheriff's office opened a formal investigation into the falsified document and the deliberate violation of a valid court order. For the first time since I had known her, Priscilla left a public meeting through a side door, with no one from the board or the community bothering to follow her out. In the weeks that followed, the association sent me a formal written apology, removed every reference to my field from its records and marketing materials, reimbursed the full cost of the survey and legal fees Audrey had accrued on my behalf, and adopted a new rule requiring a full board vote before any real estate agreement involving outside property could ever be signed again. Lenora Finch was voted in as interim chairwoman, a choice the community seemed to accept without a single objection. Priscilla, meanwhile, faced a civil suit I filed to recover damages tied to the fraudulent contract, a mounting obligation to refund every guest who had purchased a now worthless parking pass, an ongoing criminal investigation into the falsified signature, a separate dispute with the event company over the botched arrangements, and the very real possibility of covering her own legal costs, since insurance rarely extends protection to conduct a court later determines was intentional. I chose not to pursue any claim against homeowners who had simply been misled along with everyone else. My focus stayed narrowly on Priscilla, her private company, and the small handful of people who had knowingly taken part in the deception itself. I repaired the gate not long after, though I left one small scratch near the latch, exactly where someone had once planned to force it open with a pair of bolt cutters. I kept it there on purpose, A quiet reminder that property does not protect itself, that an owner has to be willing to stand at the line and speak up when someone else decides they can simply walk across it because they assume no one will stop them. Several months later, the association sent a very different kind of request, asking politely whether they might rent a small corner of my field for a modest weekend farmers market. This time they asked first. This time they carried proper insurance. This time they secured a permit from the county before a single vendor was ever contacted. This time the price offered was fair, and every condition I set was accepted without complaint or condescension. I signed that contract without hesitation, and signing it proved something I had known all along, but had never needed to say out loud. I was never against the community using my land. I was only ever against being treated as though my ownership, my judgment, and my signature meant nothing at all, simply because I preferred quiet work over loud opinions. Cole stopped by that same weekend to help me set fresh stakes along the boundary line, real ones this time, driven in with survey precision rather than guesswork and yellow ribbon. We worked mostly in silence, the way two men who trust each other's judgment usually do, pausing only when he pointed out how close the old altered map had come to erasing 80 feet of ground my family had held for 2 generations. Standing there in the afternoon light, I found myself thinking less about Priscilla and more about my uncle, about how proud he would have been that the paperwork he taught me to keep had done exactly what he always promised it would. Lenora reached out again toward the end of that year, this time not with troubling news, but with a simple thank you, telling me the association's finances had never been more transparent since the new rules went into effect. Tessa eventually built a small side reputation of her own for verifying every property document twice before booking a single vendor, a habit she credited, half joking, to the lesson Briar Glen had taught her the hard way. Even Ellis Boone mentioned, the one time our paths crossed again at the county courthouse, that he still remembered the look on Priscilla's face when he asked her that first simple question about who had actually sold those tickets. Priscilla once believed that 400 paying guests would be enough pressure to force my hand and make me open that gate. What she never understood was that a crowd, no matter how large or how impatient, cannot turn a lie into a legal right. What kept that gate closed on that cold, foggy morning was never really the chain, or the locks, or even my own stubbornness standing in front of it. It was one honest signature on a court order sitting beside the chain, the one signature in this entire story that Priscilla Dane was never able to fake.